Hey guys, just a reminder, my online course is Birth Story Academy, and you can enroll in it at birthstory.com. It's taught by me. You can be in your jammies. It's online. It's pre-recorded, and it has a ton of freebies and downloads. It's everything that you need to prepare for your hospital birth. So hope to see you in Birth Story Academy. You are in for such a treat today. I have Ashley Schein all the way from LA. She is an author, she is a writer, she is an expert on teaching you how to write your birth story. And at the end of this, she shares her birth story. So today's episode is about why to write a birth story, how to write a birth story. And then she shares, as a writer and an expert in her own writing and sharing her birth story and what that looks like. So let's get to it. What does a contraction feel like? How do I know if I'm in labor? And what does the day of labor look like? Wait, is this normal? Hey, I'm Heidi. My best friends call me Hides. I'm a certified birth doula, host of this podcast, and author of Birth Story, an interactive pregnancy guidebook. I have supported hundreds of women through their labor and deliveries, and I believe every one of them, and you, deserves a microphone and a stage. So here we are. Listen each week to get answers to these tough questions. Birth Story, where we talk about pregnancy, labor, deliveries, where we tell our stories and share our feelings. And of course, chat about our favorite baby products and motherhood. And because I'm passionate about birth outcomes, you will hear from some of the top experts in labor and delivery. Whether you are pregnant, trying desperately to get pregnant, or you just love a good birth story, I hope you will stick around and be part of this Birth Story family. Hey, Ashley Schein. Welcome to the Birth Story podcast.
Thank you, Heidi.
You guys, you just heard in the intro that we're talking about birth stories today, and this is Ashley's field. She is an expert, she is a writer, and she is going to talk to us about why it's important to write your birth story and how to write your birth story. So thank you for being here. Okay, so let's start with our personal stories. If you're listening to this podcast, then you know it is a birth story podcast. Maybe you know I wrote the book Birth Story, a pregnancy guidebook and journal that takes you through 42 birth stories of my own personal doula clients. And I'm really passionate about writing and writing birth stories. So Ashley, when I first started this podcast in my career as a doula 21 years ago now, what was really important to me is right after I attended a birth, I immediately wrote a letter to the baby.
Aww.
It was like, "Dear Ashley, I was your doula, and I want to tell you all about the day you were born." And eventually 42 of my favorite stories became a book, a teaching book, education through storytelling. And so in the back of the birth story book, there are a bunch of blank pages that say, "Your turn," right? Your story goes here. But I realized I just left the audience with just blank pages. So insert Ashley. Ashley, why are you passionate about writing birth stories? How did this come about for you?
Well, I've always been a writer, and I've always used writing as a way to make sense of my life. And then I had a baby, right? And I have two actually. They are 6 and 1.5 now. And the first birth was very confusing. Um, yeah, it was a difficult situation. I felt completely, I don't know, powerless. It was scary, and it took a lot of processing for me to you know learn from it, move on from it, accept it. And as a writer, naturally, I wrote about it in, I don't know, probably 50 different ways as a way to help me kind of understand and process and unpack, what I went through, what happened. And so at some point, actually, when my son was about 2 years old, because I left my career, I was a copywriter in advertising for about 16 or 17 years before I had him. And then I left my career to stay at home and be with him. And when he was about 2, I decided I thought I wanted to help others use writing as a tool for processing healing. So I'm a trained facilitator, and I lead writing workshops. I lead all kinds of writing workshops, actually. But I think my heart is really into writing your birth story, because it's something I'm really passionate about, having had 2 very different births and now having written about them in so many different ways.
So, Ashley, you said you had a really hard, traumatizing birth. Or I don't know, I just use the word traumatizing, but like a difficult, confusing is the word you used. You had a confusing birth. I did too on my first. And I'm a birth doula. I'm an expert in childbirth. I teach childbirth. It didn't make sense to me what happened. And people may think this is a very short amount of time. For a writer, which I am, who writes every single day since I started a journal in the 4th grade, it took me 6 weeks for me to write my birth story. I wasn't even, if I even tried, I was just filled with tears and crying and trauma. And it is in the book. Both of my birth stories are in the book, and they were extremely difficult for me to write, but I knew that I had to. So 6 weeks for me. Ashley, this is what you do, right? You write, you process. Did you start writing right away, or did you have to take some time away, like space from that experience before you started writing about it?
I definitely had to take some time. And I have found in my workshops that when it's really fresh, it's very challenging for mothers to write about. That's not to say that what they write isn't beneficial. It is. And I think really more than writing, it's the being seen, because a big part of the workshop is then sharing your story with others and then having others reflect back to you the power in your writing, the power in your story, which helps people to feel very deeply seen and heard, which is what all these moms really kind of come out needing, in my experience with writing these stories with people. So for me, it took a while. And honestly, I still write. Every time I hold a workshop, I write my story with the women who are writing, and I find a different way in, and I write a different version of the story, and I learn something about myself and my birth. It's almost like a living, breathing document. It's not ever fully finished, because I think that the way I help moms write their stories, I give them prompts, right? And I
Okay.
ask them to, think of the first 3 to 5 memories that just float to your mind, the surface of your mind, when I say the birth of your child. And many times they're surprised at what details kind of float to the surface. And then I invite them, start with that detail, start with that one memory and write from there, rather than starting with the true beginning of your story. Because I really believe that the memories that rise to the surface are the ones that want to be acknowledged. And so every time I do this, it's kind of a different memory I'm starting with. It's almost like I'm processing it over time by rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. Not to say that you have to write 100 versions of your story, but since I'm leading the workshop, I always write with my moms, and it's almost it's something that changes, and that I continue to learn from as I write it.
Even as you're speaking, I have tears in my eyes because the
Mm.
first 3 like things that pop in, like some of it is so beautiful and some of it's really hard and some of it is confusing. And even with my baby being 8 years old now, I'm still left often with why, the question why. And I've never rewritten about my experiences. So you're piquing my curiosity and my interest as a writer as you're speaking about your process and kind of working through it. So the first thing I want the audience to hear, though, is that Ashley did say it is nice to have some space, especially if parts of your birth were not just completely joyous, right? Like Yes, some of you guys are going to have that hilarious 2 hour, everyone's laughing, beautiful, easy story. And then others, you were planning to birth at home and you transferred to the hospital and you ended in a cesarean section. And there's just a lot to unpack and to process with whatever type of birth experience that you had. And I do like what you said, Ashley, of just start with that first. Because the first thing that came to mind for me was my second birth, actually, not my first. And so why was that, right? And I think it's neat to just see what's coming to the surface. So, okay, so that's our kind of starting point for this conversation, you guys. So, Ashley, you're a writer, you're a facilitator, you host these workshops. So, let's just pause right there before we dig in more. Where does someone find you? Like if right now they're like, oh, topic's really interesting and I think I might want to do a writing workshop one day. Where do we even start to like find you and to maybe sign up for a workshop?
Yeah. So I have a website, which is wildrights.co. And also on Instagram, Wild Rights is my handle. I send out a monthly newsletter with all my upcoming workshop dates in it. So that's the best way to find out any upcoming workshops. Most of them are on Zoom. I live in Los Angeles, so some of them are here in person. I actually just did a birth story workshop in person at a Mom and Me group here locally, which is really lovely. And they were brand new moms and they had their babies with them. And so that was a whole new experience for me.
Oh, I love it. I'm like, please come to Charlotte, North Carolina and join my postpartum group. This is incredible. We're going to have you on locally with some of my private doula clients to do a workshop. Yeah. I'm going to facilitate that with you for them and I'm going to join it. This is going to be.
You should. I like some of my favorite moms to write with are moms who are writing about birth that happened 8 years ago. It's like, it's interesting because as we were talking about in the beginning, like the distance it's great. I think with anything in life, it's great to write about it when you're in it because it's messy, but the time is what gives you perspective. And so it's also really wonderful to hear the mom stories about their 8-year-olds or 7-year-olds or 10-year-olds because the perspective, it's just, I get so much from that. I get so much wisdom and from hearing their new perspective. It's easier to shift into power. Like a common sort of theme in birth stories I hear is feeling powerless. And it's easier to shift into the power of my body, the power of my might, my bravery, once you have some time and distance from the experience, if it was challenging in any way.
Yeah. And when we're just in the thick of it, we're exhausted, we're not sleeping, there's hormonal changes. If I could go back in time, I would say write a little bit, but save the bigger processing for when you have some space away from it. And for those of you that are listening that are, maybe you're listening to this podcast because you're pregnant, but you've already given birth before, or whatever your story might be. I'm coming upon my oldest Max's 10th birthday, and his birth story is memorialized in the book. And I was thinking, how cool would it be to write him a new story a decade later? But I can pinpoint so many parts of his birth to his current personality. Like he was showing, it was challenging. And listen, I love my baby. He is challenging. Okay. And I can pinpoint so many parts of the pregnancy and birth story to like, he was literally sharing with me about himself the whole time I was pregnant and through the labor and delivery and the early postpartum. So I'm like, here he is at 10. And I'm like, and I sort of knew exactly who you were going to be by your entrance into this world too, which is really exciting.
I feel the same way about my son. In fact, I wrote something just earlier this week about his birth and how it fits with his personality to a T. Yeah, I love that perspective. I love having that perspective.
Yeah. So I think what we're saying, you guys, right, is Ashley and I are saying it's never too late. Like if you've never written your birth story and you have an 18-year-old, that's okay. Maybe take some time to write about it. if you have a 2-month-old, maybe start reflecting. And the point of Ashley's workshop, right, is because, and this is what I want to get into next, Ashley, I'm a natural writer. You're a natural writer. There's a bunch of people listening to this podcast that are like, I wouldn't even know where to start. So, of course, you guys can take Ashley's workshop, and that would be wonderful. But Ashley, what are some tips? Because 400,000 people listening to the Birth Story podcast are not going to sign up for your course, right? I want them to all be in your workshop, but they're listening from all around the world. There's all different circumstances and budgets. So let's talk about some tips. Where do we start? You mentioned the first memory, but like, what about people that don't even know how to put words to paper? What are some of the tips from your writing workshops that we could practice by ourselves?
Yeah, great question. I really believe that there's nobody more capable of writing your birth story than you. And many people come to me and say, but I'm not a writer. I've never been in a writing workshop. I don't think this is the right group for me, but I really want to write my story. And I say, trust me, you're going to do it. And they do. So it's pretty simple, honestly. We do talk a little bit about story structure and not worrying about nailing your structure, not worrying about nailing the plot points. Throw away everything you know about grammar. Throw away every teacher who's ever told you that you can't write or who has scratched up your paper with red pen. Throw it all away. And just honestly sink into your body. Ask yourself, like, what floats to the surface of my mind when I think about the birth? Write down the first three things that come to you. And I always say, capture whatever sensory details that come to you as well. Is there sound? Is there a smell? Is there a feeling on your body? Any sort of sensations? Obviously, labor, but like, are you wearing the hospital gown? Is it scratchy? Are you in your comfy, cozy robe? Is it soft? Like, just capture any sensory details. Is there dialogue? Is somebody talking? What are you feeling in the moment, emotionally, physically? Chicken scratch, just write them down, quick bullet points. This. Like I give them an example. I am taking a walk right now because it's supposed to help things move along. I'm in excruciating pain. I'm holding onto a tree right now because I can't even stand up. My husband is with me and I'm hating him in this moment, even though he's an amazing partner. Just write it down quickly and then move on to the next one. And then choose from those 3 or 4 or 5. Just choose the one that pulls on your heart the most and just start. That's the beginning of your story. Start from there and just let it flow. And then I say, if you get stuck, if you're like, I don't know how to get from here to the next part, then just skip down a few lines and start writing. You just kind of want to stay in your flow. The second you get out of your flow, start questioning yourself, start second guessing yourself, start worrying about grammar, is when the creativity just kind of dries up. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You just kind of want to get out of your way. And so the instruction I give is really just trust yourself, trust the story as it wants to emerge and get out of your own way. And everybody writes a story. We talk a bit about it, their story doesn't have to start in the beginning. It doesn't have to start with pregnancy. It doesn't have to start with contractions. It could start with when they put that baby on your chest. It can start with when your doctor checks to see how far along you are. Whichever memory it is, start there and then to keep going, because some stories do start at the beginning, kind of climb to a climax and go to an end. Others start at the very end and then kind of circle all the way back around to that point. So there's lots of different ways to tell a story. And as long as you're not worried about the logistics of it, I think you can do it.
Yeah, I heard you say like hugging the tree, and I was like, oh, that was part of my journey. We were out walking and we were in the woods and we were disc golfing. And I was thinking, if I had just done what you did, of just like putting that sentence out, like we were walking and what'd you say? I was mad at my husband or something and I was holding a tree. But the next thing that came forward when you said that, if I had gone back to that moment, I remember feeling the like reverberations like from the tree, like those vibrations, like almost
Mm.
like the sounds in the tree and like connecting to nature. So if I was rewriting my birth stories right now, which I don't even think I have anything about the trees and this walk in the disc golf course and being in nature. So like just having that tip like right there would have completely, like you said, I could write 12 different birth stories for the same experience, but focused on a different core memory,
Yeah,
from
I
it.
think that when we sit down to write our birth story, we get really boxed in, right? It's like the hospital or the home or the whatever the situation was, and that's what I'm writing. But when you allow the memories to kind of trigger the writing, then your writing becomes much deeper because it's coming from somewhere else, not coming from your like logical brain. It's coming from somewhere deeper. It's coming from your heart, And
Hmm.
like I started my second birth starts with this moment, and I didn't understand it at the time why it starts with this moment where I am about to push, like the baby is, she's ready to come out. I'm ready to push her out, and I'm waiting for the doctor to get there. And it's like a rush because the baby's coming, whether they're ready or not. The doctor finally gets there, gets ready, sits down, and then no contractions. It's just like my body's just like, nope. And I started laughing and I'm like, oh, she's playing coy now. She was like so ready and now she's playing coy. And I started the story that way, not knowing why until I finished writing it. And I realized it was kind of the moment where her and I took the power back. And in a pregnancy experience where I felt very caught between medical world and sort of natural birth world, and was kind of, I felt very powerless in this push pull between the two. And it was kind of a defining moment in my story where we were like, we're going to do this our way. And it was like, it was so cathartic for me to get to the end of the story and realize how big that moment was, which I didn't know when it first came up. I just let it guide me into the story that I ended up writing. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, I do. And I, as a birth doula, have been with many people giving birth in that moment where like something that was very obvious, like the baby is coming, and then it shifts. Um, and a lot of that has to do, like you said, about the balance between like our mammalian selves and also giving birth in a medical setting often. Sometimes you do see that at home birth and in birth centers too, just if you feel like you're being watched or the situation is not as intimate. And I believe that it's important to process these things. So, where I'm going to take us next, Ashley, in this conversation is the why. Um, I have my why, right? My why comes from family systems. My sister has a PhD in psychology. My family is full of writers. We talk often about therapy and listening sessions and talking sessions, and that the more we process, the more we heal. And for those of you listening, I don't want Ashley and I to be scaring you, right? Like birth is beautiful. It is magnificent. But there are components to everyone's birth that are out of your control. And sometimes when you are not in control, it can feel scary. It can feel confusing. It can feel challenging, but it can also feel electric. It can feel exciting. It can feel overwhelming joy that like even words couldn't, you could never find enough words or enough birth story uh prompts to like get you to even be able to like put on paper what that feeling is of the good, right? But the parts that are challenging, we know from science and from psychology and from data and from studies like EMDR that the more you process and the more that you talk, the more you heal. So, Ashley, that's my why. When I wrote my birth stories, it was to heal. When I tell my clients to write their birth stories, it's both to memorialize and to process and heal. And I was just wondering, what is your why because you said at the beginning of this podcast, it's not just birth stories for you. You help people write their stories on grief and trauma and hardships and birth stories. But like, what is the why? Like, why do you think writing is so powerful?
So, well, I mean, I'm going to talk about birth specifically first, because I think for me, after the first birth, like I told you, I was kind of confused about what happened. I even called my doctor a few days later and asked, like, what happened? I needed to understand and make sense of it. And you go through this experience. I kind of went into it thinking like, oh, birth is natural. This happens all over the world. Women give birth every day. And then afterwards, I guess I kind of felt blindsided. I wasn't so prepared. And I felt like I had been through a huge thing. And then you go home and you have this baby and you're learning how to be a mother and you're sleep deprived. And I didn't have the time or space to honor what happened, celebrate what happened, much less process what happened. And so I think it's important. It's a huge moment in people's life, going from, you're not just giving birth to a baby, you're giving birth to the mother that you're becoming. For me, it was a huge shift. And I needed a way to honor it. I needed it to feel like the rite of passage that it was. And so it helped me kind of, as you said, I think memorialize, honor, treat it like the profound experience that it was for me. And that's what I wanted to give to other people. I wanted to give them a chance to, like, you go home and you move right into caring for a baby. And because, like that's the way it is. And we rarely take time to, unless you have a doula who's guiding you there, you rarely take time to kind of reflect on the experience and honor yourself and what you went through. And regardless of what the experience was, there's lots of positive, amazing, wonderful experiences, and there's experiences that are hard and troubling and traumatizing. And I think writing our stories, I mean, human beings have been writing stories since the beginning of time. And I think there's an important reason why. I think we do it naturally. And so, yeah, I think it's an important moment in life to capture in words, and also a gift for your child someday, potentially, if that's something that you want to share with them. And as far as my general writing groups, I mean, people write about everything. I have people writing fiction, nonfiction, sci-fi, you name it. And honestly, it just feels good. They leave my groups feeling lighter, and it just feels good to be creative in a room full of people who are also being creative. And a lot of the experience in my workshops is sharing your writing and getting positive, immediate feedback.
I had a question about that because I was wondering how much of this is also about listening. In a few episodes after yours, Ashley, there is an episode coming out with someone who's her whole entire career is birth story listening. So how cool. So some have written their birth stories and some are just sharing their birth stories. And she just listens, which is different than dialogue, right? And back and forth and people's opinions. And then they ultimately want to tell you what happened to them when you're trying to say what happened to you. And so I was wondering, in a writing workshop, is it really like a listening workshop in the end? What does that look like? So if I just wrote my birth story and it's quite vulnerable, do people choose to not share? Do they choose to share? And then what does it look like? Do people provide feedback on their writing? What does that look like?
Yeah, so deep listening is a huge part of the workshop. Yes. And everybody after writing has the opportunity to share, but you can always pass. In my birth story workshop, everyone always shares in the end. I mean, it's very rare in any of my workshops for people to pass, because I think it's a very safe container. And once you see that, even though it is very vulnerable, you feel, I don't know, the courage of the group behind you.
Mhm.
So everybody gets a chance to read. And then what we do is we talk about what's strong in the writing. The way we keep each other safe in a workshop like this is to keep the focus on the writing. We don't make comments about each other's choices or each other's experiences. We don't talk about the writer and the writer's life. We keep the focus on the writing. So you read your story, and I tell you what moved me in the story, what I found very powerful about it, what I'm still going to be thinking about tomorrow, the reverberations of the tree, the sound you felt in the tree. Those kinds of like visceral parts of the story are what we reflect on. And what happens is that the reader feels very, the person who reads their story, the writer, feels very deeply seen and heard. And specifically in my birth story workshops, I think I mentioned this earlier, but a common theme is often feeling like not being supported in the right way, or kind of powerless, or not feeling seen and heard. And the women in the group give each other this by witnessing each other's stories and by saying, wow, that part in the story where, you were hanging onto that tree for dear life, like I could feel that. It's just, there's something in this exchange that, it's very emotional and very touching, and it's very healing. Um, and it's a huge part of the workshop. I'd say we spend about half our time writing and half our time reading, listening, and reflecting back.
Mhm. One of the things I do with my private doula clients is I provide them with a birth outline, and just a very like logistics of birth. If you're giving birth at a hospital, someone is charting to keep the hospital safe. At 8 a.m., this was happening. Medicine was administered. So on my end, my birth outlines are a way for me to be charting so that I'm protecting the person who's giving birth on their side of the story if something is different or awry. Like they have a witness in some sense with this birth outline. Hopefully we never need to use it for that purpose, but occasionally my birth outlines do need to be used that way. Most of the time, my birth outlines are used for the birthing persons and their partners, if they have one, to reflect back. Or maybe I have some memories too that they don't have at all, that were not part of their experience. But I encourage them to look over the birth outline and then add their own notes to it. And I was going to share with you from just the other week. I had a client named Kristen. She's a single mother by choice. And she had a long fertility journey and this very difficult, challenging birth. And on her birth outline, she wrote this sentence that just got me and said, Heidi, I'll never look at another birthing person the same again. I'll never look at a mother the same again. She said, it's like we go through this very profound and sacred experience. And then 24 hours, we get in the car and we go home and we're just supposed to pretend like it never happened. And then she said, I just feel like it would be really important to have space to share our birth story and share my birth story and to tell it over and over again. And she said, and every time I meet a mother, I'm going to ask her about her story. And I just was bawling. So I called her right away because our private doula clients have a meeting every single month on Zoom, and someone shares their birth story. But it made me think everyone needs an opportunity to share their birth story, not just one of the people who gave birth that month. So, of course, I invited Kristen to share her birth story so that she would have this beautiful place for people to listen. And I know that she went on to write a lot more and to reflect a lot more about her birth. So for the doulas that listen to this podcast, for the midwives and the obstetricians and the birth workers who listen to this podcast, I highly encourage you to provide an opportunity and encouragement for your clients to write their birth stories, and also that you provide space to listen to their birth stories. And to circle back to Ashley, she has the platform already. So if you don't have the capacity or the tools to teach someone how to write their birth story, or they're looking for a community to write and share in, then let's join Ashley in writing our birth stories. So Ashley, could you just give us the website and the handle one more time?
Yes, of course. So my website is wildrights.co. There's no M, it's .co.
Okay.
And my handle on Instagram is also wildrights.
Okay. WILDWRITES. Wild
Yeah.
rights. Those, like, what is it called? A homonym or a homophone or whatever with rights and rights, that could get some people. So just making sure everybody's got the correct spelling. Yeah. And you guys, now we're going to listen to Ashley reading her birth story. Thanks for being here.
I lay on my back in the hospital bed with my knees bent. My doctor sat on the stool between my legs, her gloved hands poised over my body like she was ready to conduct an orchestra. My husband and doula stood on one side of me, my nurse and the baby nurse on the other. On my next contraction, I would start pushing. Every head except mine turned toward the monitor, waiting for the signal. All eyes stayed fixed on the thin yellow line that charted my contractions. Any second now, it would begin to inch upward. The room was still and silent, a big difference from the flurry of movement just a few minutes before as the medical team quickly prepared for delivery. But now, nobody moved, and neither did the yellow line. I had been induced that morning. Rather than let me wait until I was full term and go into labor on my own, medicine started my labor at 39 weeks. A steady drip of Pitocin ran through my veins. My contractions were steady and predictable for hours, textbook perfect, according to the nurses. My baby had been at the mercy of medicine all day, and then suddenly, she wasn't. My doctor sat between my legs, a statue, ready to begin, but my next contraction didn't come. I laughed. I couldn't help it. I laughed and everyone turned to look at me. My guess is laughter isn't a common reaction to have just before pushing a baby out of your body with every bit of life force you have. But my little girl, or some higher power, had an incredible sense of timing, because suddenly my birth was no longer theirs. It was mine. I never wanted to be induced. When the alarm went off that morning, I reluctantly dragged myself out of bed. I took too much time washing my face, brushing my teeth, adding chapstick to the hospital bag. We were running a little late, but it was still dark when my husband and I got in the car. As much as I wished to go into labor on my own, I wasn't having contractions on that drive. He didn't run red lights or swerve around traffic to get to the hospital faster. It was a slow drive down empty streets with nothing but our nerves to keep us company. I found out early in my pregnancy I would be induced at 39 weeks because of my age, 42. That at 39 weeks, whether my baby was ready or not, medicine would kickstart her birth. Other than my age, there were no red flags. It was my second pregnancy. There were no complications with my first. I was healthy and strong, and at every prenatal appointment, I got the exact same information. Everything looks good. My doctor ended each visit by asking, "Do you have any questions?" And the same question always burned in the back of my throat. Do I really need to be induced? The natural birth world blames medicine and doctors for pushing epidurals and inducing labor when it isn't necessary, saying these interventions lead to more interventions that lead to C-sections. They tell us that our bodies are built to birth babies. They promise that women can do this on their own, drug-free, with very little assistance. I've seen videos of women catching their own babies inside inflatable pools filled with water in their living room, a look of ecstasy on their faces. After my first birth in the hospital, I told my husband that nothing about it felt natural. Instead, I likened it to being in a car crash. For my second, I wanted the ecstasy birth. Well, not all of it. I didn't want the bloody pool in my house, but I wanted the beautiful birth that looked more like a rite of passage than a medical event. I just wanted to be in the hospital in case there was an emergency. I don't think I ever second guessed a doctor until I became a mother. It's one thing to be a patient, it's quite another for the patient to be your child. I asked my doctor if there was any world in which she'd let me go to 40 weeks if both me and the baby remained healthy and strong. She didn't hesitate for a second. Her answer was no. She wouldn't deliver my baby any other way. The research showed that at my age, it was safest for me to deliver early. But that promise of safety didn't bring me comfort or relief. Instead, I felt fear and resistance. I felt doubt. I felt protective of the baby growing inside me. I read the research, all of it, multiple times. I read everything I could find online in the hope that it would help me find peace. But as the internet does, it only made me feel worse. The more I read, the more I felt caught between two very different worlds. They were at odds with each other from start to finish, and there didn't seem to be any middle ground. The medical world said the risk of stillbirth doubles between 39 and 40 weeks for a woman over 40. The natural birth world said the overall risk is still so incredibly low that as long as there are no other complications, it's perfectly safe to wait. No matter which way I leaned, all I felt was fear. Fear of the hospital and their flawed system, fear that something would go wrong, fear that either my baby or I wouldn't make it home. I read stories of women who nearly bled out on the table, women who managed an induction without pain medication, women who were rushed to the hospital after complications during a home birth, women who refused the induction and had perfectly successful births at home and in the hospital. I turned myself in circles, agonizing over a decision that was already made if I wanted my doctor to deliver my baby. If I couldn't have my ecstasy birth, I decided to create my own experience, some combination of the two. I reached out to a doula recommended by a friend. On our first call, I told her I was being induced on August 22nd, that I made as much peace as possible with that decision and I need someone who would support me rather than try to talk me out of it. She agreed and said the words that became my mantra. Maybe she'll beat the induction date. Second babies often come early. She told me there were a few things we could do that might help coax her out. The plan was to be induced, but that wasn't going to stop me from trying to get things going on my own. Even if it was all a bunch of old wives' tales, it helped to balance out the medical with the magical. I knew it would be a long day in a hospital room. It takes time for Pitocin to start working, and then you still have to go through labor. Many mothers recommend bringing things from home to make you feel more comfortable. The idea being that the cozier you are, the easier it is for your body to go through the stages of labor. What I wanted with me was not a pillow or blanket. It was female energy. I wanted to feel surrounded by the collective strength of the women in my life. So I asked them to send me some words of encouragement I could read while waiting for my labor to start, and an object I could place on an altar in my hospital room. Soon, letters arrived in the mail along with photos, poems, quotes, affirmations, crystals, sage, dried flowers, worry dolls, bracelets for power and strength, a cowrie shell necklace for protection, a wooden cutout of Bill Murray with the words "You're awesome" underneath, a butterfly, a dragonfly, a big turkey feather, and a small one. A dear friend sent me a round silver tray to hold everything and battery-powered candles I was allowed to bring to the hospital. I placed the altar on the dresser in my bedroom, the one that would become the baby's changing table. Every night before I went to sleep, I prayed to that altar. Whatever happens, just let it all be okay. Another friend, a shamanic healer, offered to hold a sacred birth circle for me. 6 of us gathered on Zoom. She led us all on a meditative journey. I don't know what the others saw, but I saw myself curled up deep inside the earth. I felt protected, safe, calm. I opened my eyes and tears ran down my cheeks, but I still didn't feel confident about being induced. In the days and weeks leading up to my induction date, I tried everything in my power to encourage my little girl to drop and get things moving. I walked the curbs, exercised, did lots of deep squats, went to acupuncture, had lots of sex, got Reiki, ate spicy food, and dealt with the heartburn. I choked down the herbal tea that smelled like my son's mud pies and tasted unsurprisingly like a mouthful of dirt. I bounced on the yoga ball every night in front of my battery candlelit altar, imagining my cervix opening like a flower. On my final office visit, my doctor even did the membrane sweep, but my little girl didn't budge. She wasn't ready. On the morning of my induction, we arrived at the hospital a little after 6. The room was huge. It was decorated in a beach theme, tans and blues with seashell decor. My labor and delivery nurse happened to be the same nurse I had when I gave birth to my son 4.5 years earlier. My husband and I liked her. She was kind and calm and always made us feel like she was on my side. That morning, I told her I wished I had gone into labor on my own. I understand, she said. It seems like induction has become very common, my husband said. We see a fair number of them, she said. You don't have to do this. You can walk out of here right now if you want, she told me. I looked at my husband. In my throat, I felt all the fear I tried to swallow for months. I'll give you a few minutes to talk, she said, and left the room. But at that point, there was nothing left to talk about. I had made the decision. I just didn't know how to make peace with it. Maybe I believed that giving my baby a natural birth would have some effect on her and our bond, or that it would say something about who I am as a woman and a mother. But in the end, the data scared me. My doctor's insistence scared me. I wanted my baby to be alive, and I wanted to be alive to raise her and her big brother. It was a long day at the hospital, but I had my husband and doula to keep me company. My altar sat on the counter next to the hospital bed, underneath the corny seashell artwork we all laughed at. For hours, my contractions were perfect and predictable, that yellow line moving up and down on the screen in an ideal rhythm. Right up until the moment my doctor sat down on the stool between my legs. Everyone in the room watched the monitor, waiting. I soaked up the silence. But when nothing happened, I turned to look at the monitor too. How strange, I thought. My perfect contractions stopped. It was only a brief lull, but it was long enough to change everything. I laughed. I finally wasn't afraid. 7 minutes later, on my third push, I gave birth to my daughter, a red and purple ball of curled up limbs covered in chalky white vernix. My doctor laid her on my chest. I held her in my hands, leaned back, and closed my eyes. Ecstasy, it turns out, is what you feel when nothing else matters. Her fierce cries filled the room.
Thank you for listening to Birth Story. My goal is you will walk away from each episode with a clear picture of how labor and delivery might go, and that you will feel empowered by the end of your pregnancy to speak up, plan and prepare for the birth you want, no matter what that looks like.